Hi folks, this is the last of the three Mozart bio lectures, and today we'll be dealing with Mozart's musical style and contributions. I'm anticipating that this should really just fly by. So the textbook says that Mozart, quote, exemplified Viennese classical ideals, elegance, balance, poise, refinement, sophistication, end quote. Now this is completely true, but I think it may give the faulty impression that Mozart was this consummate gentleman. I put a link in the description to one of his less known well-known compositions, which I think will show you that he's this hilariously irreverent guy as well. That being said, Mozart really was the perfect classical composer. Like we talked about before, he lived smack dab in the middle of the classical era and wasn't a sort of transitional composer like Haydn before him, or Handel even, or Beethoven after him. He was firmly rooted in the classical tradition, and throughout his short life, he ventured into pretty much all significant genres of classical era music and perfected those genres. He really is as close to the Platonic ideal of a classical era composer and musician that you possibly could get. I've also popped what I think is a pretty cool scene from the movie Amadeus into the description just because it gives what I think is an interesting look into what may have been how Mozart thought and composed. Mozart also contributed greatly to what would become structural norms. Symmetry and balance are very much classical era virtues, and you'd see that in Mozart's compositions. He typically used symmetrical phrase structures involving four measure phrases and was highly instrumental in solidifying what exactly was meant by sonata form just because of how much he wrote using that structure. Sonata form is, after all, the ultimate sort of long form musical symmetry. Mozart was heavily influenced by J.C. Bach, especially in terms of the development of the piano concerto genre. And as we'll see in a minute or two, Mozart ends up writing 27 piano concertos, which is kind of nutty. Just as with sonata form as a whole, Mozart is important to developing the style for piano works in the 18th century, and we can see this in both his works for solo piano as well as concertos. Specific to the structure of concertos, and this really goes for concertos in general, not just piano ones, he's very important to developing the normative concerto structure, especially with having this sort of double exposition in the first movement. Mozart is known as this opera titan, and that inclination toward vocal music finds its way into his instrumental writing. There's a lot more lyricism in his instrumental music than we've previously seen, certainly more than Haydn before him or Beethoven after him. This lyricism comes out especially in his slow movements. Mozart also pushes the standard harmonic language of the era. He's still largely diatonic, but he really starts to involve a ton of chromaticism, which adds to a listener's sense of tension and release. He was greatly influenced by the court orchestra of Mannheim, which was, famed for its virtuosity. One of the most famous and lasting concepts associated with Mannheim is the rocket theme, or the Mannheim rocket, which we're going to dig into a bit when we get to the fourth movement of Eine Kleine. Mozart also started to expand the standard instrumentation of the orchestra by more regularly involving wind instruments. Now, as a violinist, I think that's a big mistake, but, that might just be my ego talking. We've touched on this a number of times now, but opera was obviously very important to Mozart, and his works focused on three kinds of opera: opera seria, buffa, and singspiel. Opera seria is, as you know, serious Italian opera, which is sung throughout. An example of this is Idomeneo. Buffa, on the other hand, is comic Italian opera, also sung throughout, and Figaro is an example of this category. Finally, Singspiel is German, and instead of being sung throughout, we have spoken dialogue. Magic Flute is an example of this genre. One thing important to note about Mozart's operas is that he has these characters which are more realistic than the ones we saw developed by composers before him. However, I think it's inappropriate to give Mozart sole credit for that, since he worked on his operas and these characters with librettists. Nevertheless, that the characters in opera are being made more realistic and compelling than before is an important inflection point in the history of the opera genre. And finally, the K number. Ludwig von Koschel was a guy who cataloged all of Mozart's music in 1862. And so when you see a K followed by a number on a Mozart score, that's what it's referring to. Okay, some very quick notes by genre. Symphonies, we got over 40, including Hafner, Linz, Prague, the famous number 40, and Jupiter. Concertos, we got 27 piano, 5 violin, 2 flute. There's a flute and harp concerto, oboe, clarinet. There's also 4 horn concertos, although the final horn concerto wasn't finished. As for chamber, we got 23 string quartets, including the Hunt and Dissonance. We got duo sonatas, trios, quintets, serenades, divertimenti. Piano, we have sonatas, fantasias, and variations. Then we got over 20 operas, including The Abduction from the Seraglio, Don Giovanni, Così fan tutte. And for vocal music, we have lieder, concert arias, motets, masses, including the Coronation Mass, and maybe most importantly, the Requiem Mass. And that's a wrap on our Mozart bio lectures. Next, we're going to be looking at Eine Kleine. If you found this lecture helpful, please give it a thumbs up, and hitting the subscribe button really helps out the channel. Thank you.